The last panel of the day is about media and race, and you know, there's an awful lot to be said. Some of it has been really announced in a kind of oblique, indirect way already, but now we're ready to kind of meet it head on. First, we're going to hear from Joe Klein, who I hope many of you know him as a political correspondent for New York Magazine. He writes for other magazines, but he's done some excellent work and some very, it seems to me, thoughtful and candid work in New York Magazine. He's written, in addition, two books, one called Payback and A Life of Woody Guthrie, which I think many of you have read. His article on Race, the Issue, appeared as a cover story last year in New York Magazine and got a lot of attention, and it well should have. Joe Klein.
Thank you. It's been kind of fun for me to sit here and watch people define themselves as either second thoughters or first thoughters. I never changed my position over the last 25 years, that kind of thing. I want to announce myself to you as a mongrel. Oh, can you hear me now? Okay. I'm announcing myself to you as a mongrel. There are some things that I have changed my mind about over the last 20 years. It's a very, very wrenching, painful process. It's called growth. I want it to stop now, but it probably won't. There are other things, though, that I really haven't changed my mind about, that I still have the first thoughts I had, you know, 30 years ago. Two things in particular that I have not changed my mind about at all. One is the principle of equality, the fact that everybody should be treated the same, that everybody is the same. I think Stanley Crouch addressed that more eloquently than I could ever this morning. The other thing that I haven't changed my mind about at all over the last 30 years is the fact that white racism is a fundamental and disgraceful and disgusting fact of American life. I think that we can't go through a conference like this where we're trying to think in subtle ways about these problems. I don't think that we can re-emphasize and emphasize that enough. We have to remember that white racism is a fundamental fact of American life. In fact, I think that when the militants, when the left-wing militants say that white racism is growing, they're right. It's especially been growing over the last 4 or 5 years in New York in response to the enormous crime wave in the city, the crack-driven crime wave. And, you know, I'm reminded of white racism from time to time, especially when I'm with black friends. I was standing on a street corner with a black friend, or as Leonard Jeffries, the black CCNY professor, would say, a melanin-rich or non-melanin deprived friend. The other day we were trying to get a cab and we got into a conversation about the Mets. We were talking, in fact I had proposed that Darryl Strawberry, the outfielder, had checked himself into an alcohol and drug abuse clinic as a negotiating ploy in order to get a higher contract, because then he would be perceived as a victim by both management and the fans. But anyway, we're in the midst of this conversation about Darryl Strawberry, and I notice cabs are going, we have our hands up trying to hail a cab, and cabs are going by and by and by, and finally we look at each other, and he nods at me like this. I'm telling you, if I had to live with that every day of my life, I probably would have gone out with a machine gun by now. You have to acknowledge the very basic fact that for black people every day in this country, they go through something like that. Something that I had a lot of intimate experience with throughout most of the 80s. I was one of those people who was living in a gentrified neighborhood. In fact, I was living 3 or 4 blocks away from Spike Lee in Brooklyn, which is why his movie pissed me off so much. I mean, there were all these people who were in my neighborhood who weren't in his movie. All the, you know, the bus drivers and school teachers and social workers, just normal folks who had jobs. I mean, how many people in that movie who were black actually had jobs? Also, there was another group of people in the movie who we didn't acknowledge at all, and those were black policemen. We had 4 living on my street. It was very interesting to note that in Do the Right Thing there was not a single black cop. But anyway, we were always very conscious of stores in the neighborhood, and Eric, you'll be happy to know that when the Korean fruit market came in, my neighbors, both black and white, were cheering because we were so happy to have a market where there was going to be good fruit and vegetables. And we would keep a close watch on the stores that were coming into and leaving Fulton Street, which was the main shopping drag. And I remember talking about the butcher with a friend of mine who also wasn't melanin deprived, who was an accountant. And I said, boy, that butcher isn't bad. And he says, that's because he gives you the good meat. You should see the crap he gives me. And so I think that we can't lose the sense of outrage about the daily atrocities that black people go through in this country. And I think that we also have to be aware that as crime increases and as white racism increases, the most poignant victims are the people, are the black people who are actually playing by the rules, who are really working hard. The vast majority of kids in the schools who have to not only go through the gauntlet of white people crossing the street when they see them coming, but also have to run the gauntlet of their friends who say that they're acting white when they study. I think we have to remember that. We have to keep it in mind. And also, I think that there are things that government can do to deal with this. I would really like to see a much more aggressive effort on the part of government at every level to run sting operations on employment agencies and real estate brokers to make sure that the principle of equality is adhered to in the selling of homes and the getting of jobs. I think it would be a very wonderful development in this country if every real estate broker had in the back of his or her mind every time a young black couple came to look at a house or an apartment that this might be their license on the line. Those are the things I haven't had second thoughts about. On the other hand, about 15 years ago, I was a young reporter in Boston working for what was then euphemistically called a C-level paper, the real paper. And the big issue in town was busing. And I remember going out to cover busing, going into it as a good card-carrying, well, not card-carrying, but I was liberal. And thinking, wow, this is a good thing. You know, it'll put blacks and whites together. It'll really be, it'll be good for the city. It'll be good for the white kids. Until I actually started interviewing people, especially black people. I couldn't find anybody who was in favor of it. I mean, for one thing, it was a pretty wrenching thing to put your kid through. For another thing, I remember this one woman who lived in a housing project, Columbia Point, and she said, God, we just spent the last 10 years getting a breakfast program into our school, and now they're sending my kid into Dorchester to this, where he's going to be brutalized by these dopes, and he won't even get breakfast. The other thing was that blacks were making a lot of the educational sacrifices. Blacks were being, people who here from Harvard and from Boston and Cambridge will remember that Jeremiah Burke High School, which was in Roxbury, I think sent about 30% of its kids to college. South Boston High School, Southie High School, I think graduated more kids into the Marine Corps than they did into college. It was a markedly, I don't remember the exact figures, but the Burke School was much better. And in fact, the blacks were the ones who were making the educational sacrifices in the first year of this incredibly stupid busing plan. At the time, I thought, well, you know, they got it all wrong. What you should be doing is having kids from both South Boston and Roxbury going out into the fancy suburbs where the judge who made this decision lives and having them get the benefits of the, you know, the education out there. Now, 15 years later, part of the growth process, I guess, I realized that that would have turned the schools in Brookline and Newton and all those fancy suburbs into predominantly black, predominantly blue-collar or blues-collar, Stanley, white kids in any case. You can't really force these things. The interesting thing about all this, about what I was finding in the streets, and the enormous resistance among plain old black civilians to this incredible plan, this incredibly destructive plan, was that you couldn't find very much of it at all in the Boston Globe. In fact, the place where you'd look to find the truth every day if you were covering the story was John Kiffner's dispatches in the New York Times. The Boston Globe was following the cardinal rules. For the last 20 years, I've lived in either Boston, Washington, or New York, and in each place you have this massive, establishment paper, which, and the attitude of the Boston Globe, I think, is the same as the Washington Post, is the same as the New York Times. It's a combination of cowardice and cheerleading on these issues. I think that if the busing story had been taking place in New York, the place I probably would have looked for the truth about the story would have been the Boston Globe. It would be too painful for the local paper often feels that it has a diplomatic function to perform in situations like this, to smooth things over. Now, one thing I might add as a caveat is this. When you talk about the media, the race and the media, I get really nervous about the media. I even get nervous about what I just said about the three great institutions in Boston, Washington, and New York, because that implies a kind of controlling intelligence, and I would never accuse any of those three of having a controlling intelligence. I think that there are enough exceptions to the rule that should be cited. One exception, I think, is that the Times reporting of the Tawana Brawley case, which also was mentioned earlier here, was absolutely courageous and absolutely dispositive. I mean, after reading the Times, you knew that that poor kid was lying. She was scared she was lying, and the people who were her, what was it, family, they were advisors, wasn't it? Their advisors were full of it. Times is to be congratulated for that. There have been other cases, I think the Washington Post and the Boston Globe as well. And I would add that anybody who's been at this conference today will be very interested in a documentary that is going to be on PBS on May 15th by Shelby Steele, who I wish were here because I think he's written more cogently on the subject of race than anybody else I've read over the past 3 or 4 or 5 years. And there are a lot of people who've written cogently on it, and many of them have spoken here today. It's Steele's take on Bensonhurst, and it's an hour-long documentary, the Frontline series, and it has something in it that so much of the reporting about this sort of problem doesn't have, and that is complexity. I mean, it's amazing how simplistic, how simple-minded most of it is, either from one side or the other. And I think that what Shelby Steele really gets at is, in his writing, is the psychological complexity of these problems. Now, to move on, the last thing I want to talk about is something that Glenn Lowry was talking about at lunch, and that is moving the ball forward and talking about the real racial problem that we have in the country right now, which is the existence of a small but growing and very, very significant underclass. I spent the last year covering the mayoral campaign in New York, which was a truly bizarre experience. I prepared for it by a somewhat less bizarre experience, but still bizarre all the same, which was covering the presidential campaign the year before. And I remember asking Michael Dukakis what he would do about the underclass. And he said, the what? He says, I don't think there is such a thing as an underclass. I was kind of amazed, but it did prepare me for David Dinkins saying the exact same thing, saying that he didn't think there was any such thing as an underclass. Now, to me, that was a really remarkable statement. I mean, you know, if you just look at the demographics of it, the nature of poverty in this country has changed. During the 1930s, when the welfare state really was established, the poorest group of people in the country were the elderly. Now they happen to be the richest. Now the poorest group of people in the country are the children. So just structurally, things have changed. And you know, single-parent families. If you look at the out-of-wedlock birth rate, an array of statistics have show quite clearly that that the nature of poverty has changed, and David Dinkins wouldn't even acknowledge it. And when I looked around for all my colleagues to be asking the same question, or asking, huh, you don't think there's such a thing as an underclass? Silence. And what were they covering? They were covering whether or not Rudy Giuliani's first marriage was annulled or legally through the church, or whether or not it wasn't. At one point, there was a real heavy investigative story in the New York Daily News. Giuliani had been marching in the Israel Day parade, and he picked up the wrong sash. It said Grand Marshal instead of just Marshal. And the question was whether he had done that deliberately. During the course of the campaign, I kept on asking the candidates this question, and never got an answer that I could buy. I think, and I thought then, I still think, that the essential question that any politician in New York City, and certainly any urban politician in this country has to face is this: how do we as a society confront, how do we deal with the 15-year-old mother on welfare? What do we owe her, and what does she owe us? We know, I think that most of us would agree, that we owe her some form of support. Maybe some of us wouldn't. But I think that it's fair to say that I certainly believe that we do. But what does she owe us? Does she owe us the pledge that she will remain drug-free? Do we have the right to drug test her? Does she owe us the name of the child's father so that we could go out and dun him, and if he's not working, put him to work and dun him? Does she owe us the promise to attend some classes where she learns how to take care of a baby, how to diaper a baby, what nutrition is, that kind of stuff? It was amazing, the outrage that this question would engender in audiences. I remember one night I was at the 92nd Street YMHA at a candidates forum. I asked this question and was hissed. It's amazing. And I think that, Peter, David, if you're going to have another one of these things, one of the questions that we should start considering if we're going to move forward in this is, how do we deal with that kid? I mean, because after all, she is a kid, a 15-year-old. I talked to David Dinkins about it later. I said, he thought I was, by the way, by even asking this question, David Dinkins thought I was, this is one of my favorite phrases, blaming the victim. I said, no, the 15-year-old isn't the victim, the kid's the victim, her baby's the victim. I said, but you had a 15-year-old daughter. What would happen what would you do when she broke curfew, when she came in late? Well, if she didn't come in at all, what would you do? He said, I'd ground her. And I said, well, look, you know, these kids, they're kids. They're our wards. We're taking care of them. We're paying their allowance. Don't we have a responsibility to provide, even if, you know, to provide more than money, don't we have a responsibility to provide some form of restrictions, some chores maybe? You know, isn't that what you do with a teenager? He said, well, you know, a lot of psychologists and sociologists are looking into this problem, and I'll defer to them. But in any case, I think one of the central issues that we're coming to in the question of race and in the question of the cities and in the question of the underclass is, when do you take the kids away? Under what circumstances do you take the kids away, and where do you put them? Daniel Patrick Moynihan said to me a while ago, I don't know if it was on the record or not, but I guess it was. He said, we're going to have, at the end of the 20th century, some of the same institutions we had at the beginning. Chain gangs, orphanages. It's sad, but I think that if we're going to move this discussion forward, there are important things to remember, and it always has to be done with a spirit of compassion. I can get as angry as anybody else about the utter stupidity of the militants who will call me a racist simply because I raise these issues. And sometimes I'll lose my head and say dumb things in response. But I think we always have to remember that white racism is a fundamental fact of American life, and we always have to remember to be compassionate. That's all.
Thank you, Joe. Eric Brindell is the editorial page editor of the New York Post, and he writes a syndicated column weekly, and I'm sure you've seen his pieces in New Republican Commentary. Eric?
Thanks, Peter. As a latecomer to the conference, I apologize for not having heard earlier speakers, and also because it's late in the day. I'd like to try to be very brief. I'd like to throw out, in fact, one episode that's now taking place in New York for discussion, because I think it points up at least some of the questions that are interesting with respect to the larger issue of race and the media. I'd like to raise for discussion purposes an episode we've been following quite closely at the Post editorial page. I have in mind the boycott of Korean groceries in the Flatbush section of Brooklyn, an effort organized by a pretty dubious outfit that pretends to speak for Flatbush blacks, pretends in the sense that it's given itself a coalition-type name that implies wide support. The boycott has been led by one Sonny Carson, in a sense a self-proclaimed racist. I don't think that's unfair. Last year, during the New York City mayoral campaign, Carson protested charges that he was anti-Semitic by explaining that he's anti-white. What's interesting about this episode, one of the things that's most interesting, is that it's received virtually no media attention, really, until this past week, despite the fact that it's been going on for nearly half a year, and despite the fact that it's one of the ugliest manifestations of overt racism that at least I can remember in the recent history of the city. Even the treatment it has received has been confined to fleeting references in opinion columns. Joe Klein has discussed it in a recent article in New York Magazine, but there's been no systematic, in fact, there hasn't even really been occasional news coverage in the way of ordinary reporting. And when the New York Times, and I have to agree with Joe in a sense, or at least the first part of what he said. I think the New York Times is a very important institution in New York life. Mentioned the boycott for the first time. It did so in an editorial which told us a bit, I think, about why the media finds this episode, the boycott, so difficult to deal with. I'd suggest that establishment media institutions are hesitant to confront the phenomenon of black racism. That's, as it were, issue one. And I'd further suggest that these institutions either have no idea or not all that much interested in who, in fact, are genuine black political leaders and who are pretenders and hustlers and people without serious followings. I think this is a mistake that establishment institutions would be far less likely to make with respect to the white community. And I think it's a failure that's quite serious in its implications. That, if you will, is issue two that this boycott raises. The boycott of Korean stores is not Carson's first. He and others have mounted anti-Korean campaigns in different parts of New York several times during the last 6 years. I also know that there are parallel efforts underway, or have been, in Washington. I gather there's one that's starting up in Baltimore. Almost always in the New York episodes, a Korean grocer is charged with abusing a black customer, and I'd like to say at this point that I don't mean in any way to suggest that such incidents don't take place. I can't think of grocery stores, and the police tell me at least that they don't know of grocery stores that have been open for a while in which there aren't incidents occasionally in which the manager is charged with abusing a customer. The tone of the boycott that then ensued in Flatbush and that has ensued in in the earlier cases really pretty much speaks for itself, I think. Picketers have carried signs reading, "Don't buy from Koreans." Leaflets are handed out telling local blacks not to shop with, quote, "people who don't look like us." Koreans maintain that they are taunted on a regular basis as monkeys. They're told to close their shops. Allegations have been made that Koreans set up these groceries with the help of a secret fund, a fund that also enables these stores to prosper. Carson and others have suggested that the Flatbush stores be turned over to blacks so that what have been referred to as African collectives or African farmers markets can be established. But as the City and State Human Rights Commission discovered when they finally took a look at this particular episode, the boycotters actually don't seem to have any real demands. There's nothing to get a purchase on. There's really no path that anyone has been able to identify toward resolution. And indeed, when a local Haitian minister proposed a compromise and negotiations, he received threats and felt altogether understandably, I think, compelled to withdraw. The latest we hear from this particular episode is that it is in a sense breaking down into simple extortion. Demands are being made to a number of Korean grocers throughout Brooklyn that they pay protection money in order not to be subjected to picketing. I think it's safe to say that if this were a case of whites or Koreans marching around with signs reading "Don't buy from blacks" for a 4-month period, we'd have a national story on our hands. So again, the failure to report the boycott, I believe, turns on a sense that manifestations of black racism are close to taboo as subject matter. Reporters and editors fear this subject. They fear charges of racism. They fear threats. They apparently aren't inspired or animated by an enormous sense of sympathy for the Koreans. And they are, I think it's fair to say, in a sense, bewildered. I think I can honestly tell you that the newsroom of the paper for which I work as editorial page editor, the newsroom of the Post, is just as bewildered as are the other dailies in New York by this episode and by an uncertainty over how to treat the subject. As a consequence, journalistic standards as to newsworthiness are all but abandoned. The Times editorial described this episode as a manifestation of a new black militancy. The boycott appeared in the context of a list of such manifestations. The Milwaukee case, which I understand Glenn spoke about at lunch, was a key subject in the editorial. And the reader was told to see these events, in a sense, as cries of pain. The Times said a Korean grocery was being boycotted by, quote, a black neighborhood. Thus, Carson, who is familiar as an unserious racketeer, was transformed in this editorial into an entire neighborhood, into Flatbush blacks in general. It's almost unnecessary to note, I think, that a few racketeers with political pretensions could never be confused with an entire white neighborhood by the media. It simply wouldn't happen. I also think it's fair to note that extortion and racism aren't really political militancy by any definition. The racist character of the boycott, which I alluded to earlier, has never really been discussed in the general media. The Times, ignoring the previous 6 years and the various other episodes, seem to take the notion that a dispute between a merchant and a customer sparked these events entirely at face value. But at least this editorial, I now realize on reflection, noted the episode. We do have in New York 3 other dailies. We have weeklies of influence. We have countless TV stations, and they've said virtually nothing at all. There's so much wrong here that it's hard to know where exactly to begin. We don't, in the media, seem to know the difference between genuine black leaders and professional race racketeers, and that's sort of astonishing in 1990 New York. After all, New York is a city with a black mayor and with distinguished black political leaders. So making this mistake is, I think, far less excusable in New York today, even than in other places. Why are the racist misdeeds of a small group of people attributed to a whole neighborhood? Where's the condemnation or even acknowledgement of black racism as a phenomenon? Why is there no attention to the fact that blacks have been intimidated into refraining from shopping at the stores in question? Our letters to the editors tell us this. Private letters that I've received tell me this, letters from blacks. I have to assume that able reporters could easily ascertain that this is the case, and I can't really explain why there's an unwillingness to report it. I can't explain the absence of sympathy for the plight of the Koreans. I can't explain the failure to confront the conspiracy theory at work here, these notions of a secret fund. There haven't been very many calls to Mayor Dinkins, save for one, and again, in this case issued by Joe Klein, to practice the healing that led to his election over the allegedly divisive Ed Koch, because for those of you who are not from New York, it was the notion, I think, of David Dinkins as a healer, as someone who could bring a divided city together, that led to his election more than any other single factor. And it was the notion of Koch as a divisive personality, particularly with respect to racial issues, that led to Koch's defeat. I would close here with an admission, and I think you understand this to some extent simply from the tone I've adopted, which is that I don't have a full sense or a full explanation of the media's failure here. I can understand the failure of politicians not to want to get involved in an episode of this kind. Politicians aren't always brave. Black politicians aren't always brave. White politicians aren't always brave. Black politicians have more reason than white politicians for not wanting to get involved in this particular case, for not wanting to issue criticism, for wanting to work quietly. And we haven't really heard from anyone in an outspoken way in the political leadership on this subject. As for the media, I can only offer my best attempts to grapple with the issue. That's what I've tried to do here. I'd be interested in hearing from people out there as to their sense of what it is we're dealing with here. And on this note, I'll close, and I thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Eric. Harmeet Singh is an assistant editor presently at Policy Review. You may know of her as a former editor-in-chief of Dartmouth Review during one of its stormier periods, and she's a recent graduate of Dartmouth College as well.
Thank you, Peter. Can you hear me? No? Okay. Well, it's my misfortune to be speaking towards the end of the program after so many more distinguished people than myself have had shared their far more profound thoughts with you than what I have to say. But maybe since I'm coming from a slightly different background, maybe my thoughts will be useful to you as well. I was born in India. My parents decided to leave their homeland and come to the United States for a couple of reasons. One was that as members of a religious minority, they felt that in a nation dominated by other religions, their success and happiness would always be limited by the fact that their spiritual beliefs were different. Whereas in the United States, we would be free to practice our religion without any fear of persecution. My father was always fond of reminding myself and my brother that there was no excuse for not succeeding in America, because in this country people were judged not by the color of their skin or by who their father was or what they believed, but by their capabilities and achievements demonstrated in the public arena of equal opportunity. As I grew up, I believed that my father's formula for success would pay off. Like many other Americans of Asian descent, I did pretty well in school and went on to an Ivy League university. It was only when I arrived at Dartmouth College in the fall of 1985 that I realized that equal opportunity was not necessarily what my father had thought it was. During the next 4 years, my perceptions of equality and fairness were strongly challenged. I had come to a place where professors and radical students, and of course the professional charlatans that accompanied them, turned reality on its head, where the lingua franca contained words like white male patriarchy, ethnocentricity, Eurocentrism, heterosexism, plurality, ethnoviolence, phallocracy, oppressive structures, and re-education. That last word, re-education, is quite descriptive of Dartmouth College's attempted relationship with today's incoming freshmen. For although I considered myself only partially educated when I arrived at Dartmouth, it seemed that I was already in need of a re-education, because I didn't quite know the rules of the game. Although I am a woman, I didn't perceive the widespread sexism that my female professors told me existed. Although I was a minority, I didn't particularly feel any solidarity with the various ethnic groups asking for and clamoring for special victim status and demanding special programs and perks for themselves. And most telling of all, I was actually surprised to find that whereas I had always taken my race and other people's race and ethnic status for granted, even though I grew up in the supposedly racist South, at Dartmouth, everybody from the students to the faculty to the administrators to the bums around the town seemed intimately preoccupied with race and affirmative action. Everyone, that is, but the incoming freshmen. And they quickly learned to categorize themselves according to whether they were oppressors or oppressed, privileged or deprived, socially conscious, or, like myself, in need of sensitivity training. But I had come to Dartmouth for an education, not a re-education. And the fact that Dartmouth's political status quo, its unchallenged and patronizing assumptions about minority handicaps and entitlements, went unquestioned by any campus leaders, any papers, or any outside sources, led me to eventually join the staff of the Dartmouth Review, then the only voice at Dartmouth attempting to reverse the hidebound orthodoxy of the college. Founded in 1980 as a much-needed antidote to the college's news organs, the Dartmouth Review sought to fight the party line with a weekly combination of hard reporting, sharp editorials, and provocative humor in the form of satire. A radical activist in the 60s, I guess, which defines some of the speakers here today who've had their second thoughts, might have called what the Review tries to do maximizing the contradictions. Many of the review's journalistic forays have embroiled it in heated controversy, and the paper's editors have often been the targets of attempts by the school administration to expel them, suspend them, or otherwise mark their careers. Well, I'm not going to bore you with a litany of the review's confrontations with Dartmouth on the issue of freedom of speech, because we could be here all evening. But I do want to point out the contradictions in the current debate about race, free speech, and the media's proper role in covering these topics and the potential costs that it can incur. It seems that whenever a conservative, at least, tries to broach the topic of race, be it in relation to quotas, affirmative action, apartheid, or a host of other social issues, he is immediately confronted with the reality that most liberals, and especially the doctrinaire type now found on most American campuses, find the topic of race to be their exclusive domain. Indeed, the arguments used, or even the race of the individual in question, makes no difference. One classmate of mine on the review staff, who happened to have committed the double sin of being conservative and black, was burned in effigy outside the headquarters of the divestment movement during our freshman year. Other minority staffers have received death threats. And these things should come as no surprise, really, because the hero of Dartmouth's minorities today is not Martin Luther King or even Mohandas Gandhi. Their hero is Malcolm X, evidenced by the fact that a huge mural depicting him dominates the entrance to Cutter Hall, the Afro-American Society's home. And the International Students Organization, which can always be counted on to confuse its third world grievances with the incessant demands of other victim pressure groups, recently changed the name of its headquarters to the Fidel Castro House. So, as you can see, violence, heavy-handed intimidation, and leftism tend to go hand in hand at Dartmouth. The cri de coeur of Dartmouth's orthodoxy is diversity, a word that immediately signals to the listener that someone is about to begin preaching to the choir. Dartmouth's President Friedman likes to refer to his dream of Dartmouth, and I quote, as a pluralism of otherness. And he's from Harvard, by the way. And questioning the amorphous and criminally overused symbolism of diversity, or raising impolite questions, rather, about the intellectual integrity of minority quotas, the paint-by-numbers approach to achieving diversity, is tantamount to committing blasphemy against the state religion. To point out the self-segregation, the separate black and white tables in the dining hall, the different black and white fraternities rather the black fraternities that don't admit white students, and to point out the spiraling tension created by the escalating demands of pressure groups. To make note of these facts is to invite vilification, is to beg to be labeled with the McCarthyist label of racist. I myself have been called by professors, sometimes in the classroom and sometimes outside the classroom, a pre-fascist thug, a racist, a dog, a Klansman, a Nazi, a brown shirt, even an imperialist. And this is perhaps worst of all to me, because imperialist always makes me think of the British. So I really, call me a Nazi, but don't call me an imperialist. A fine example of how racial hysteria can obfuscate and hijack completely non-racial issues is the so-called Cole incident. Professor William Cole, a jazz musician, taught a course at Dartmouth officially entitled Music in the Oral Tradition, better known as the most blatant gut or intellectually deficient course in the entire curriculum. In 1984, the newspaper did its first expose of Cole, observing that his lectures consisted mainly of soliloquies about urban reality, white conspiracies to get blacks, Cole's difficult-to-describe personal philosophy, and frequent diatribes against honkies, many of whom were taking the class. The review revealed that Cole devoted little attention to music and required little from his students other than their acquiescence in his lax teaching style. And no one has ever disputed the accuracy of the article, but faculty members immediately accused the review of racism for critically examining the class because, of course, Cole happens to be black. Although Cole's race was neither an issue in the article nor a factor in the decision to expose his class, liberals immediately joined Cole in postulating a causal link between his race and the decision to do the article. The newspaper's second, more spectacular run-in with the professor came in February of 1988. One snowy afternoon, two freshmen trudged into the Main Street offices of the newspaper and asked to talk to the editor, who was at that time Christopher Baldwin. One of the students told Baldwin that he wanted the newspaper to investigate Cole's teaching style and class content, not knowing of the paper's attempt to do so 4 years earlier. The student had been ordered by Cole not to come to class wearing his Indian t-shirt, a free welcome gift given to all freshmen by the newspaper in an attempt to keep the school's traditional symbol of the Indian alive. Baldwin had coincidentally just been asked by another freshman to investigate the similarly content-free English course being taught by a white professor and decided to do a double investigation. The articles on the English professor and on Cole were prominently featured together in an issue of the newspaper, and the article about Cole contained a transcript of one of his classes given to the newspaper by a student, a transcript so devastatingly revealing in itself that the newspaper hardly needed to add any additional comments to prove the point that the college was taking students for a ride by giving them credit for this class. Because of Cole's earlier lawsuit against the newspaper, the Review's lawyer advised Baldwin that the two professors should be invited to respond, unedited, to the charges made about their classroom performance. The English professor's supervisor replied to the paper, promising that changes would be made in the content and requirements of the course. When Cole, on the other hand, failed to respond several days after the first article appeared, Baldwin, two other staffers, and a photographer went to the room where he holds class and waited outside until the class was over. Their purpose was to deliver him a written invitation to respond. When they went in to deliver the invitation, however, they got a lot more than what they bargained for. Cole immediately erupted into a string of obscenities and began poking his fingers at Baldwin's eyes. The Review photographer naturally began taking photos of this scenario, and the tape recorder was running to record it as well. Cole then lunged at the photographer and ripped off the flash from his camera, hurling it to the floor and destroying it. The tape indicates that the students throughout addressed Cole as Sir, while he unleashed at them a non-stop string of obscenities. When the professor noticed that the tape recorder was running, he asked the students to leave, which they promptly did. The next issue of the Review contained 3 photographs of the incident and a complete transcript of the 3-minute encounter. The very same day, campus police delivered notices to the students that they were to stand trial for invasion of privacy, disorderly conduct, and harassment. In fact, the editors met Cole in a public auditorium after his class was dismissed and took the tools of the trade with him to clearly indicate their purpose. In fact, the Review writers behaved no differently in pursuit of their story than Mike Wallace might have behaved investigating a hostile subject for a 60-minute segment. But Mike Wallace happens to be protected by the Bill of Rights, whereas college counsel Sean Gorman has often noted with some satisfaction that Dartmouth, as a private institution, can easily pretend as if the Bill of Rights simply does not exist. Soon after the students were charged, Dartmouth President James Friedman, responding to a mob camped outside his administration headquarters, summarily pronounced the Review 4 guilty even before their trial, denouncing their behavior as mean-spirited, cruel, and ugly, and proclaiming Cole to be a invaluable asset to the international jazz community, which I'm sure Mr. Crouch can verify is not true. At a hearing chaired by the dean of the college, the 4 staffers who were denied counsel and the right to cross-examine witnesses were found guilty of the 3 charges against them, and in addition were convicted of a new charge, vexatious oral exchange, which sounds like some kind of immorality charge, but it's actually a bureaucratic neologism, meaning that they had argued with Cole. Editor Baldwin and the paper's senior editor were suspended for a year and a half, the photographer for 3 terms, and the other staff were given a year's probation. And what of Cole? Although many of his colleagues privately acknowledged that he was an embarrassment to the college, publicly the lionization of him reached ridiculous heights, and any faculty who questioned whether the professor might not also be at fault were themselves labeled as racist. The Review lawsuit filed against Dartmouth immediately following the incident, and a New Hampshire state judge ordered Dartmouth to reverse the suspensions because the trial had been unfair and the charges against the students unproven. The issue of damages to be paid by the college to them is still pending. I'd like to point out that the Review is uniquely situated. It's a very lucky paper, financially and legally independent of the college and the beneficiary of loyal alumni and conservative supporters around the country. It could hire top-ranked New York attorneys to defend it. But most other campus papers or independent students with iconoclastic views on affirmative action and victim studies departments are not usually in such an advantageous position. The threat of university action scares most students away from speaking their minds. Papers like the Vassar Spectator, which similarly tried to expose hypocrisy and anti-Semitism on the part of a black student activist, quickly find their budgets withdrawn, their offices closed, and their school records permanently blemished. And these threats are not isolated or rare. In the past 18 months, regulations barring free speech or ad hoc attempts to shut down student newspapers have appeared at Stanford, Emory, Brown, Arizona State, Berkeley, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, UCLA, State University of New York at Buffalo, University of Michigan, University of Wisconsin, Vassar, California State University at Northridge, and several others, and the list is growing longer every day. And who, after all, are the real victims of the liberal stranglehold on the issue of race? White students may suffer, but the talented ones will usually find a good school to accept them, although it may not be the school of their first choice. Asian students may find it harder to get into the top schools, since they must unfairly compete against other Asians for their seats. But they, too, will generally excel wherever they are accepted and overcome the restrictions placed on them. I think that the real victims of affirmative action are the minority students the quota system was set up to help. The ones who are very intelligent and who would have been admitted without affirmative action suffer the same taint of doubt about their right to be there as the students who are marginally qualified and benefited from relaxed standards. Although their achievements brought them to a top school, their color keeps them from being accepted for what they are, and if they are accepted and welcomed into the mainstream of campus life, they can be assured of taunts from other minority students. They will be called Oreos, black on the outside, white on the inside, or incogs, short for incognegro. Too often, it's true, too often as a result of this peer pressure that makes them question whether they have betrayed their people, they become the most articulate defenders of affirmative action, issuing the most passionate denials against the fact that affirmative action constitutes double standards. They perpetuate the hoax, paradoxically further degrading the legitimacy of their minority peers in the eyes of the mainstream. And then there are the students who are admitted by virtue of relaxed standards. I do not exaggerate when I say that many minority students struggle through their first year at Dartmouth, simply playing catch-up, sitting through remedial or lower-track English and mathematics courses, while other students clear their distributive requirements out of the way and proceed to higher study. When it comes to time to pick a major or concentration, many minority students, ill-prepared for a major in physics or classical studies, opt for the easy way out, concentrations in the victim genres of Afro-American, women's, and Native American studies, disciplines distinguished mainly for their lack of discipline, for their vague imputations of aggrievement, their all-consuming crusades to rewrite history. Suffice it to say that 10 or 15 years from now, these students may consider their choice of study ill-considered. And Dartmouth has really done them no favor by taking them in unprepared and pushing them out again 4 years later, arguably no less behind the curve than they were before. In the short term, will restrictions on the press and on free and open discussion of race-related issues on our nation's campuses protect the feelings of minorities? Perhaps. But do they allow the university to fulfill its historical role as a temple of truth, as a refuge from the pedestrian pressures of party politics, as, above all, a place where the quest for knowledge is the paramount goal? We can each judge for ourselves whether feelings should triumph over hard facts, but there has to be a better way to offer equal opportunity on our nation's campuses. I hope one day we can all agree that openness and a free exchange of thoughts and ideas ultimately leading to a better understanding of one another is better than the silence and organized deceit that now passes for constructive dialogue on the issue of race. And I hope free presses on our nation's campuses, including the Dartmouth Review, will play a large role in that debate. Thank you.
That's good, Harmeet. Thank you. Elvis Mitchell joins us from Los Angeles. He's a film writer for California Magazine, and he does television criticism for Village Voice, and he is an arts commentator for National Public Radio. Elvis?
Sorry. Go ahead. I have to stand because the wind chill factor was starting to set in over there. I guess I feel a little out of place here today because as a liberal, I like the feeling you guys would like to have Marlon Perkins tag me and follow my migratory pattern or something. But my feeling is that, you know, I do agree that individual rights can sometimes be trod over, and that the media itself can act as an institution that doesn't allow individual rights just by the inertia that tends to keep minorities out. I remember when I was TV critic at the Herald Examiner a few years ago, I was at a press conference, and like everybody else, I tend to get a little starstruck, and I had a chance to go meet an actor I had a lot of respect for. I don't know if I should mention his name. Well, anyway, I walked up to Richard Dreyfuss, and I said, well, I just talked to him for a bit, and we sort of got along, and he asked my name, and I told him I was Elvis Mitchell, and he goes, wow, Elvis Mitchell, I read you all the time. I didn't know you were black, which made me wonder if I should drop the G's at the end of my words or something in print, just so that he got the impression. But there's a certain kind of inertia that tends to keep, well, especially, as maybe Stanley can tell you, minority arts writers out of certain publications, because despite the fact that they talk a lot about social justice, newspapers, the TV and movie industry tend to be more lax and give it more lip service than any other group, because there are no federal laws to make sure that they have to comply with hiring practices or anything like that. And so it always seems odd to me that there are always these crusades that seem to be sort of misguided. And because of that, a misrepresentation in the media, which tends to become a misrepresentation to the rest of the country. And since I concentrate mostly on movies, I think about something like Mississippi Burning, in which one of my favorite scenes in that movie, which many of you may know, was about the murder of the civil rights workers in 1964, was when a black FBI agent was flown down to threaten one of the redneck lowbrows. And I'm thinking, 1964, I guess Hoover took time out from bugging Martin Luther King and putting cameras in all the hotel rooms to hire a black FBI agent, something that didn't actually happen. And that, too, it also took a white British film director to make this movie. And it didn't seem to occur to anybody that the moral courage of a little black woman who didn't want to give up her seat on the bus was as responsible for this whole movement getting started as anything else. And there tends to be a lot of this sort of what I call the white man's burden kind of filmmaking. You get something like Cry Freedom, in which poor Kevin Kline has to suffer while apartheid rages throughout South Africa. And our sympathies are extended to these people. And what that tends to do is to reinforce a certain kind of powerlessness that actually does filter back to the black community. And I can tell you that there tends to be a lot of head shaking and hand wringing over something like A Dry White Season, in which Donald Sutherland again gets to suffer for all those poor black people who, gosh, just don't have anything to do with themselves. And you would just never think that black people were empowered to do anything, that they were capable of independent thought or any such thing. And I think another thing, too, something that Joe certainly talked about, is that newspapers, the LA Times certainly qualifies as much as the New York Times and the Washington Post, tend to not cover a certain kind of event in the city, I think, too, because they don't have to. It gets back to responsibility and accountability. They don't have to be accountable to the communities. I mean, where there are situations where there are two newspaper towns, as LA used to be before the Herald Examiner went out of business, then in order to be competitive, the LA Times would have to do something like, well, show that Mayor Tom Bradley was engaged in some rather unspeakable practices economically. They had to realize this because the Herald Examiner forced them to report this. It doesn't seem to be the same here in Washington, where the Post is kind of a big, dull, gray gorilla that can move wherever it wants to and exceedingly slowly. Certainly the New York Times is forced in the city to handle certain things in its metropolitan pages. But the national version of the New York Times, you would think the paper were written on Mars. I mean, there's no mention of the city. You get no feeling of what it is the city has to offer or what the special minority interests there feel about anything, which Eric talked about here earlier. And it gets into a situation where, certainly as a black spectator of the media, I start to feel more and more disenfranchised from it. And I certainly attempt to, when I go out and speak at schools or whatever, to let people know that if I can do this, anybody can. And by virtue of that, I mean that it's not that difficult a thing to crack. But the feeling is that there is no place in the media. And I learned this from lots of students who say, well, I don't know what to do, and I have to try to send my clips out to newspapers or call TV stations, and I never get a reply. And I have to respond to them that it is indeed inertia, and newspapers, well, movie studios, what have you, tend to be very cliquish, and hiring is based on who you know, because knowing somebody relieves you of the necessity of having to make a decision about them. Well, I know this person, therefore I don't have to worry if they can write or not. And you certainly tend to see that in a lot of newspapers. I'm not going to name anybody else because I think my lawyers may be paying attention here today. But what we've got to do, I think, in certainly these future conferences, is realize that by keeping, I guess, just the institutionalized racism that keeps blacks, Hispanics, certainly the minority populations out and disaffected, then that creates a certain kind of mistrust and distrust in those neighborhoods. So that when newspapers show up only to write about a shooting in the neighborhood, and not to attempt to encourage when there are some attempts until it's much too late when a neighborhood tries to take itself back by running crack dealers out. Instead of going out and talking to these people in the first place, it comes as kind of a last resort. And you would think that, well, God, these people finally got fed up after crack dealers drive up and down the streets with Mac 10s and black Mercedes-Benzes driven by 17-year-olds sitting on phone booths because they're not tall enough to drive the cars. Well, in fact, there's been dissatisfaction for a very long time. And just because this stuff isn't written about doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And I have to try to expose these lies to black youth and to Hispanic youth who just feel like, well, why should I try to become a part of this? I cannot affect a change because they don't care about me. And I think that perceived apathy becomes dangerous because then it makes people feel that why should I try to affect some sort of change from the inside? Why should I work towards trying to become a part of this system and to offer some sort of change and to show that I am capable of being something other than a drug dealer or what have you, when it's just easier for me to stay outside because there's no place for me anyway. I really find it extraordinary that this sort of thing just isn't addressed. And whenever I go home to Detroit and find it to be the case where the situation is just written about in terms of statistical things. It's just a toll where you see one number after another, and all you get is just this rising toll of fatalities instead of going into or attempting to go into a human cause and then finding one story per year where this poor student is trying to get out of it, or to go back to the entertainment industry, where the one movie that comes out in the year is written about and then it flops and the executive goes, well, I tried, it's not my fault. A quote that I think comes from Goebbels, Joseph, and Bartlett's quotations. It just sort of allows these people to relieve themselves of responsibility in trying to affect a change or bring in other viewpoints. I mean, I think this would make newspapers enormously interesting. On the other hand, we have the black press, which goes too far in the other direction by trying to offer advocacy journalism and saying that everything that's done in the community is terrific, and boy, aren't we trying hard, and not looking at the causes either. So you get this sort of myopia on both sides, when both sides are looking at each other but not seeing each other, and then we all miss out because we don't hear about what's happening anywhere. I mean, and as newspapers and everything are just owned by 2 or 3 companies, and a company style starts to set in, a corporate style, in fact, where you get the USA Todayization of the country, and it's all this communal we, which isn't really a community because it leaves so many people out who aren't able to join in and voice their opinions and express themselves, then we get a country that is not a democracy in any sense of the word, because the Bill of Rights and freedom of speech don't mean anything if people don't hear you when you talk. I guess I'll let everybody go now so we can make home in time to see Twin Peaks.
We got some time for some questions. Somebody want to line up there? Would you give your name?
Yeah, my name is Mark Liedl. I'm with the Heritage Foundation. I had a question for Joe, but it also raises an issue that Eric brought up. I think it's very important, Joe, that you talked about racism and the fact that racism does still persist in this society. I think many whites don't understand that, and many conservatives in particular don't want to acknowledge that. But you were very careful in your comments to say white racism every time you mentioned racism. And I have a black friend who argues with me that there is no such thing as black racism, and certainly Gus Savage would have us believe that as well. So my question to you is do you believe there is such a thing as black racism? And if not, why not?
The answer, quite simply, is yes. I just didn't think that, given the audience, I had to remind him of this. I figured that, given the audience, I had to remind him of the other. People from New York, or people who've read my work over the past year, especially during the course of the mayoral campaign, know that that as the various charlatans, phonies, and racists made their pitches during the course of the mayoral campaign, I was very careful to note who was what. And when Calvin Butts, I remember after Bensonhurst, said that there was no such thing as black racism, I was sufficiently outraged. Of course there's black racism. You know, Stanley Krauss said it before, we're all human beings. And blacks are as vulnerable to the kind of narrow-minded stupidity and hatred that whites are. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Susan Salisbury. My question is addressed to Mr. Mitchell. I'm concerned about your closing statement about freedom of speech doesn't mean much if you don't have access to the media. And I would think from hearing that there were not Xerox machines for rent on virtually every corner of every major city of the United States where you can get, you can write something if you don't have a typewriter by hand and have it copied for a nickel a page and stand out constitutional right on a street corner and hand it out to anybody who will read it. It seems to me that perhaps what's lacking is some commitment, some willingness to spend money, and some entrepreneurial effort if people are not hearing what other people have to say.
Oh, well, certainly there's, there's an attempt to harness some sort of black enterprise to get magazines going, but again, I think you pay more attention to something that you pay money to read than something you get handed to you for free. I mean, you sort of throw it away and tend to not pay attention to it, and that's something I guess should be addressed too.
My question, my statement is directed to Mr. Brindell. My name is Itabari Njeri. I'm a reporter for the Los Angeles Times. I cover the issue of diversity for the Los Angeles Times, and one gets the sense that the continental divide is more than geographic here. It's also intellectual and psychological. We've been covering extensively the issue of interethnic conflict, particularly between the African-American community and Korean merchants. In Los Angeles, more than the green grocers that you find in Brooklyn, where I grew up. I know the neighborhood you're talking about very well. I was there when the boycott started a few months ago. There are swap meets in Los Angeles, and there have been boycotts mounted by the African-American community. The mayor's task force has a group called the Black Korean Alliance, which has been formulated specifically to address the tensions in that city. It has not been very effective. Neither blacks nor Koreans know much about it. I went into the home of a black community activist intending to do a simple interview and found half the neighborhood there to complain to me about the Korean merchants. And they, believe me, black racism is alive, unfortunately, and well. Talking about Koreans, they said, I am tired of all these Japanese taking over. I wish they'd go back to China. At the same time, however, the woman who called the meeting, who was a legal secretary working for the city of Los Angeles, had gone into one of these swap meets to return a piece of merchandise a friend had given her for a gift because it didn't fit, and asked to exchange it. The merchant, she claimed, immediately shouted, get out, you stupid, you're unemployed, you're lazy, you're a nigger. He had never seen this woman before. She claimed that this was typical of the type of treatment she received, as do many people in the black community. The problem exists on both sides. When I talk to Korean merchants and to spokespeople about this issue, they point out to me, the glass was dirty when we came here, the filter was sullied when we came here. It's true, we have kind of internalized a lot of the stereotypes about black people, which are reinforced by both perception and the reality of blacks coming in frequently in these neighborhoods and robbing them, mistreating them, speaking to them in foul language. At the same time, the black patrons point out, and quite legitimately our reporting has discovered, that they are abused by the merchants. When we write about this story, however, we don't talk about it just in terms of racism between these two interethnic groups. We talk about that, the xenophobia and racism that does exist among black Americans who are also very frustrated that they can't have these businesses themselves. They can't get the loans to have these businesses. They feel excluded from the economic system. But we also talk about the superstructure of white racism that exists in the country, that has created this mythology about what a black person is, that these immigrants come in and internalize, and about the economic system that makes them both scramble for this dwindling piece of the economic pie in America and leads to this kind of classic scapegoating. So we do talk about the racism in the black community, the xenophobia, the internalized racism that this new immigrant group deals with, but also the superstructure of racism, which Mr. Klein talks about as a daily reality for people of color and blacks in particular, but also the economic structure that accounts for the frustration on both sides for these two ethnic minorities.
Then you are way ahead of us.
We certainly are.
And it must be rewarding to know that, because we, in fact, don't see the issue covered at all. And what I was endeavoring to speak to most of all was that fact, the reluctance to treat the subject at all.
Right.
And what I hope to do was try to throw out some notion of why I think the media is unwilling to confront it in any of these several ways. As to the phenomenon and your interpretation of it, I don't doubt that there's frustration among blacks with regard to the apparent business success of the Koreans. And I said in my remarks that I wouldn't in any way suggest that there haven't been incidents of the kind to which even the boycotters in the episode now taking place in Flatbush refer as having triggered the incident. I also get letters from people that tell me that they have encountered cases in which Korean merchants have been abusive. So I'm aware of all that. The only thing I'd like to take issue with is, at least in New York, so far as I can tell, there is an organized effort on the part of the Korean community, as distinct from City Hall, as distinct from the political leadership, and as distinct from the media, somehow to try to break through. Koreans and some blacks, when they're not afraid to do so, and I spoke to this because I think intimidation is a very real issue here, Koreans have endeavored in an organized way to reach out, either by making financial contributions to neighborhood black causes, which is what's happened in Flatbush of late, and to the extent that they've, if you will, internalized racist stereotypes, I detect on the part of the leadership of that community an effort to try to get beyond that.
That's true in LA too, and also the black boycotters there have been very successful in resolving the conflict by simply bringing in some of the practices of the Better Business Bureau. Some of the things are very simple to resolve. A lot of it is the language barrier, and the Korean merchants themselves have set up programs to educate the people who work in these swap meets and these stores, because it's much easier to say, leave, go, if you don't speak the language, than to say something in polite English. And a lot of the tension stems from that lack of communication, and also just simple incorrect business practices like having a clearly stated return policy. And both communities have worked together so far to resolve those issues along those lines.
Could I address something else that you said? There are a hell of a lot of successful West Indian black storekeepers in New York City.
Right.
And so while I obviously acknowledge that white racism is a major problem in this society, it isn't a paralytic problem. And I think that that people who pose it as such are really doing a major disservice to the next generation of black kids coming up. In fact, there was a black guy in my neighborhood who owned a pizza parlor, and he had a real serious problem because a lot of the brothers wouldn't buy from a black guy, figuring that he couldn't make good pizza. So he couldn't find any Italian kids, but he did find this Palestinian kid who kind of looked Italian and put him out front, and was able to run a half-decent business.
I agree. Race is not the issue alone, and I happen to be West Indian and East Indian and African American, and I'm second-generation American, and I'm familiar with the literature that tends to compare African Americans with West Indians, and points out that race could not be the sole factor, since we have two groups of African descent, and when you compare the statistics in terms of education and wealth, there is a big disparity. I think the immigrant phenomenon has a lot to do with it as well. We know that people who come here from other countries have a tremendous drive. They have a certain stake in their success that native-born people don't have. I agree it's not race alone, but there are other cultural factors that one has to weigh, and I don't think it's a fair comparison to simply say, well, if another black group succeeds, why can't African Americans?
Thank you very much. Stanley?
Yeah, I wanted to make a statement about this stuff, and also then to ask Eric and Joe something. I think that one of the things we really have to look at in all of this is some of these policies on these campuses and stuff strike me to comprise a kind of a let the natives have their drum beating festivals because that's the most we can expect of them. You know, it's like in the Jungle movie when the safari is going someplace and the natives are playing drums in the middle of the night and the white woman comes up and she says, those drums, why don't they stop beating those drums? And then the guy says, oh, well, you know, they're very afraid and they're talking to their gods now and they have to do that in order for us to continue the safari. They'll be all right tomorrow morning. And I think that that's kind of what we've got. We've really developed, I think, an extraordinary form of paternalism that passes itself off as empathy. So that you know, you can have a black guy who's a professor who conducts himself the way Ms. Singh described Bill Cole, and that's all right. I mean, you know, they had a hard time. We brought them over here as slaves. Therefore, we shouldn't really expect them to be good teachers. You know? Oh, well, it's not really racism. They're expressing the great frustration that black people have with their history in America. You know, and so, and you see it, one of the things I find most fascinating in media right now is that this new record that Public Enemy has, which comes out against interracial romance, has anti-Semitic suggestions, even embraces this, there's this lunatic woman here in Washington, I think, named Frances Wellesley, who has this theory that white people suffer from melanin envy. You know, and I mean, all of this stuff is on this record, and these white critics keep saying, and it even refers to white people as devils. And one of the tracks, I think, called Polly Want a Cracker. And you read these reviews, and these white guys are going, well, you know, once we set aside the reprehensible things on this record, you know, we have to realize that it's a great dance record. And to me, that's true racism, because it's like, well, what do we expect of coons? They don't have to be intelligent.
Well, you have to
they don't have to not be racist.
Remember in the New York Times it was listed as a jazz record?
Right. But no, but what I mean is the fact that now what they're essentially saying is, if these coons can come up with a good dance record, all these other things are all right.
Well, it's also too, it's all right to group it as this black art form, just to call it jazz. I mean, not to even pay attention to it, just to say, well, they're doing it again. I mean, that's part of it.
Yeah, I think that's it. But I wanted to ask you finally, and so I think that that what we're looking at is a very strange kind of paternalism that a lot of white people don't really realize that they're exhibiting. See, because when you don't allow the native to be treated as a man or as a woman, then you're saying that he or she is incapable of being a complete man or a complete woman. And if you allow him or her to maintain a form of adolescent behavior, you know, and call that his or her identity, then I mean, that's paternalism at its worst. Finally, Eric, I would like to ask you and Joe, do you believe that if these stores in Brooklyn were owned by Israelis, say, who are often complained about you know, other Jews often complain about Israelis. They say they're the worst, you know, they're really obnoxious, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, but what I'm saying is do you think that if these were Israeli greengrocers and Sonny Carson tried what he's apparently brought off, do you think it would have been ignored for lo these many months?
No. No. The Koreans in New York, at least, are strangely politically powerless. I wanted to
The
take
classic first-generation immigrant reaction.
They are utterly bewildered by the criminal justice system, the language, how to deal with the media, and as a consequence, and as a consequence, they've had very little success in trying to come to terms with this episode. And no, I think probably had it been another group, there would have been some kind of counter effort, and the media would have been compelled to address it and probably the nature of the boycott itself, which is, I would suggest with respect to what I learned about what's taking place in Los Angeles, a very different phenomenon, because Carson and these people have no substantive agenda. I think it would have been impossible for the media not to deal with.
Sure. But now, you know, Sonny Carson has been on WLIB many times. Yeah. Now, what I mean in WLIB is listened to by many people in media just to find out what the state of the lunatic part of the black population in New York is.
For those who don't know, WLIB is the black AM radio station in New York, which is partially owned by David Dinkins, and is completely owned by Percy Sutton.
Joe, why don't you go ahead and answer?
Let me just respond. About what you said up front is that there can only be one standard of behavior for everyone. There are no excuses for behaving like a racist. There are no excuses for behaving like a savage. And if you want, I got a proposal. You and I could form a joint Frederick Douglass Brigade that'll go and integrate the black eating tables at a lot of these colleges and the dorms. I think it's time that those kids know that what is unacceptable in South Africa is unacceptable at UMass, Amherst, and all the rest of these places.
Yeah, right on.
Oh, we can go next week.
Do it.
Yeah, that's it for me.
Thanks, Tim.
A question for Mr. Klein. When you discussed white racism, you gave an example of some taxi drivers in New York. I believe, from my experience, majority, if not the overwhelming majority of taxi drivers are either minority people or very, very recent newcomers to New York. How do you square what you said with this?
I think that's probably true, and I remember when I was living in Brooklyn, there were an awful lot of black taxi cab drivers who, when I told them where I wanted to go, said, "What are you, crazy?" Yeah, I mean, all I was trying to get at was the fact is that you always should be reminded that this exists in the society, and I would assume that everybody here would agree that it can never be used as an excuse.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Leslie Carbone. I'm with Accuracy in Academia, and I'd like to ask Harmeet to describe for us the nature of the outside media coverage of the events involving Professor Cole and the Dartmouth Review.
For the most part, the coverage was focused on the issue of freedom of speech as opposed to the actual behavior of the professor or the behavior of the newspaper. For example, the Washington Post editorialized that Dartmouth was wrong in trying to clamp down on freedom of speech, no matter how reprehensible the speech might be, no matter how crazy the Dartmouth Review is, no matter how, extremist it is. And so, in fact, I'd say most of the coverage ran in that direction. One of the people who called me a pre-fascist, I think on the advice of a lawyer who probably told him fascist would be actionable, was Mort Kondracki of the New Republic. So he's mainstream and fairly,
He's also been accused of
moderate.
being a pre-fascist.
Yeah, probably, but that's the way most of it ran, and that's been the tone of the coverage of the review pretty much throughout its history.
Abigail?
Well, I have a question actually directly related to that. I wonder if, in retrospect, you have any, as it were, second thoughts about how you would have handled the whole incident. That is, in retrospect, do you think the press coverage has been very bad? Do you think it would have been possible, had you anticipated some of that coverage, to have handled the incidents in a way so that you could have headed off some of the subsequent negative publicity?
Well, that's possible. I wasn't the editor at the time, but I think it's important to note that I didn't mention it, but that the first time Cole was covered by the Review, he slapped the Review with a $2 million lawsuit saying that he was not given the opportunity to respond, and the article was therefore libel that went unchallenged. And naturally, on the advice of counsel, the second time we did an article, our lawyer said, give him the chance to respond. You know, make sure everyone knows he's given the chance to respond, and if he doesn't respond, then he can't sue you. And so after he did not respond, naturally we didn't want to expose ourselves to a lawsuit, and the lawyer said, go take this to him, make sure he receives it from your hands, and that's the way it was handled. I think that, I don't know how much more respectful the students could have been, calling the professor, sir, you know, sir, please don't smash my camera, you know, sir, please don't use, you know, blankety blank, 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 white boy racists, you know, every 3 seconds, which is what, you know, he called them. And after that, of course, the events, you really can't predict. Some of the reviews articles go unchallenged. Some of the reviews articles kind of escalate like this because Cole is very adept at portraying himself. I mean, he's made the ridiculous assertion that because he's black, he can't get gigs as a jazz musician. And, you know, you know, this is true. I mean, this is his, you know, I'm in Hanover teaching because, you know, I'm black, and I'm glad I'm not a black woman, you know, because I would never get a job. And, you know, someone should point out to him that a lot of jazz musicians are black, but...
I have one other question, if there's time. Directed at Joe Klein. I loved your piece when it came out in New York Magazine, and I kept quoting it, but one of the conclusions that I drew from that piece, as well as a lot of other coverage of the mayoral campaign, a lot of other writing at the time, was that David Dinkins could never win. And I wonder whether you saw, in the end, any tension between the message you delivered, or any contradiction, I should say, between the message you delivered in the article and the fact that, in fact, Dinkins got a huge white vote, although, as I remember, you said in the piece, look, New Yorkers, white New Yorkers have had it with blacks.
Mm-hmm. There are those who live in New York and know what the city is going to go through over the next 2 or 3 years, given our financial crisis, who would argue that David Dinkins didn't win. But be that as it may, I think that what happened was this, and it came as a surprise to me. Certainly I was wrong, and it was a surprise to almost everybody who covered it. But what happened was when Yusuf Hawkins was killed, Ed Koch was gaining a lot of strength at that moment. And what the death of Yusuf Hawkins did was it stopped politics at that moment for about a week. And it stopped Koch's rise. And it also scared the hell out of a lot of people. And at that moment, David Dinkins' response was, it was a gut response, it was something that he really believed, and it was a healing response, I thought. And I think that he won a lot of votes at that moment. And I think that people in the city turned to each other and said, look, we all got to ride the subways together. It's getting pretty scary out there. It's getting pretty tense. And what's going to happen if we don't elect this guy? And I think he got a lot of votes. Elizabeth?
Elizabeth Wright.
I'm Elizabeth Wright, and I have a question for Mr. Mitchell. You were talking about the difficulty that black aspirants to becoming journalists with the mainstream newspapers, obviously, the difficulty that they have, and the fact that you send in clippings and so forth. And for one thing, I feel that tens of thousands of whites can tell you that they have been rejected over and over again. I mean, you're talking about a highly competitive field, and I find this over and over again with blacks who want to go into the most competitive and the most glamorous professions, and yet completely ignore black newspapers and the black media. For instance, I was at the National Association of Black Journalists. Their last convention was last year at the Hilton in New York. And there was no black newspaper presence there at all. What it turns out is this a big recruiting ground of all these young blacks who want to work for all the white mainstream publications. And the next day I called up Rod Doss, who is the editor of the New Pittsburgh Courier, a very fine black newspaper. And he told me that this particular strain of blacks are just a bunch of snobs. They want nothing to do with black publications. They don't even want to cut their teeth on them. And so they have no interest in really supporting the publications of the black community by actually working on them. They all have fancy notions that they don't want to even begin earning any less than $40,000 or $50,000 a year to begin with. So I just wonder if you could address yourself to that.
Well, certainly. I began in black newspapers, and I know lots of people who look at that as being a way of getting out. But then, too, I also found that in sending clips to lots of places, that came from black newspapers. They didn't get read, and I would talk to editors after getting accepted in place, and I go, well, yeah, we didn't pay attention to those, just because you're right. I mean, it is a very competitive field, and what I talked about before really does stand, that you have to relieve these people of the burden of making a decision about you because they don't want to make a mistake. If you've been published somewhere else, if you've been published someplace they know about, they go, oh, well, it's easier to accept that. So it is true that I find some problems with the National Association of Black Journalists, too, because it is basically a club, and it's just sort of a networking thing in a lot of cases where they just want to get together and have parties and then immediately get a job after graduating from college. But I didn't come up that way, and lots of people I know didn't come up that way. And I've been extraordinarily lucky, and lots of people I know, lots of other black journalists haven't. So that seems a bit of an oversimplification, just because I do understand there are people who work hard and have a tough time getting in.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you. Thank you. I told you at the beginning of the session today that we were going to ask some questions. I don't suppose that we've had, any answers, at least systematic answers, but I think you'll agree that the questions have been elegantly considered and really quite eloquently discussed as well. Been a kind of thinking out loud here I think we've undergone, and it's the best kind of thinking out loud where you've had some people giving a piece of their intimate selves to you, which is, I guess, all that we can do for each other. We've had first thoughters, second thoughters, neocons, liberals, libertarians. We might have had a couple of leftists, but they bowed out, perhaps because of the formidable reputation of David Horowitz primarily and myself. I think that the only thing you can really say about this is that we're in this thing up to our necks, and it's not going to go away. It's something we're all embroiled in, and the really only conclusion that I can draw from what we've said today is that Burke was pretty much right. All that's required for evil to succeed is for good men and women to do nothing. Please join us upstairs. We're going to have a reception, a Rabelaisian bacchanal, you might say, with an open bar and some things to chew on. Thank you very much for coming.
That concludes this panel discussion entitled The Media and Race, sponsored by the National Forum Foundation Second Thoughts Project. A reminder now to be with us tomorrow for live gavel-to-gavel coverage of the United States Senate. That's live tomorrow afternoon beginning at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 11:30 a.m. for our West Coast viewers.